It's an incredible honour for me to be up here to talk about Clyde Hertzman, and I hope I get through it. I think for you, Clyde was your hero, your icon. I want to tell you a little bit about how much he was for all of us as well. And it is all about social justice. It is all about fighting the inequalities of this world so that we have an opportunity to improve outcomes for our children. So I've called my talk Science with the Soul, Data to Action for a Healthy Child Development. And I want to come back to that Science with the Soul. Great. So I want to start just really by talking about Clyde's career track very briefly. I then want to talk about Clyde on a world stage. I want to talk about Clyde and us, his Australian fan club, very personal, very important for us. And I then want to finish by talking about what we need to do to build on Clyde's legacy. So you all probably know this in Canada, but many might not from the rest of the world, that Clyde is a McMaster graduate in medicine, then chose to go into occupational epidemiology, did his fellowship of the Royal College of Physicians in community medicine, and a research fellow in occupational epidemiology, then back here at BC. And then you can see as he went through, sorry, the next slide, ending up being in the social and life course stream in the public health and director of the the Human Early Learning Partnership. But I think one of the most important factors was the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research, which was such a powerful organisation for challenging the whole reason and rationale of population health and looking at the importance of early childhood. And these are Clyde's professional and scholarly activities. And I think that what I wanted really to say about his career track was how he grew from a public health physician with an interest in environmental health to become a champion of data, basic science to explain causation, appreciate how healthy early brain development needed nurturing environments, the interplay between genes and environments as biological embedding predicted lifelong health and capabilities, the bigger picture of how communities and overall society impact on developmental trajectories, and how to use the best epidemiological data, like the EDI, for example, to influence social and health policy locally, provincially, nationally, and then internationally. And it was this holistic taking of everything from anywhere to improve outcomes that I think was the model that I took from Clyde. In addition to that, if you read his CV, which of course is like this, the number of students and postdoctoral people, the mentoring, the teaching that he did is wonderful. And I know that they must be grieving so much to have lost such a fantastic mentor. So Clyde on a world stage, and there are three major things I just want to talk about in this one. One is the 1990 book that he edited with Dan Keating, Developmental Health and the Wealth of Nations, which really became the Bible of early child development. And I don't know if people here in Canada realise just how much that book influenced us internationally. The second was the WHO Social Determinants of Health Commission that was chaired by Michael Marmot, in which Chapter 5, the early child development, was the most important influence on that whole report. It's a quote from Michael Marmot. And then, of course, the EDI, which has become the international measure. And I believe that the EDI should become, and probably is becoming, the international GDP of child development, to counteract this juggernaut of a world encouraging us to produce individual wealth to the detriment of the majority. And I think that the measurement by EDI could start to turn that around. So I've just got a few quotes that I've used again and again and again from the Developmental Health and the Wealth of Nations. And this is one of my favourites. We are witness to a dramatic expansion of market-based economies whose capacity for wealth generation is awesome in comparison to both the distant and the recent past. At the same time, there is a growing perception of substantial threats to the health and well-being of today's children and youth in the very societies that benefit most from this abundance. And this is the very famous kind of concept that you can see repeated around the world of this three-tiered system that Clyde set up. And I want to read actually from him about how he described this figure. The relationships are summarised in this model, which represents the individual life cycle as an arrow, piercing a bullseye, which represents society. Society is shown to have three classes of factors, represented by three concentric circles, which represent determinants of health and well-being at three levels of social aggregation. At the most intimate level are the factors associated with social support, the children in the middle of our society. At the next level are the factors at the level of civil society that can buffer or exacerbate the stresses of daily living. Finally, at the broadest level of aggregation are the state factors, particularly national wealth, income distribution, and the structure of the opportunity created by history, geography, and fortune that support or undermine health and well-being. To me, that has guided a lot of the thought around the world. And the next slide, which talks about both the latency and pathway models for cumulative risk development, with latency being, of course, the critical periods of child development, and the pathways where you've got sequential additions of risks that one bit of the pathway leading to the next to create this cumulative risk. And of course, one of the most obvious and horrible examples of that latency is the photos of these brains on the right-hand side there of children in Romanian orphanages who were neglected for the first 6 to 12 months of their lives, with irreversible brain damage occurring, compared with the child on the left who had a normal, nice, nurturing and importantly a good parenting for that. And this kind of thinking that came out of this book led to these kinds of diagrams. I don't know if you can see this. You should have come up to the front. But this is the kinds of pathways that we've developed in our institute. This is from Sven Silburn and the team, which show from the genetic factors, but the healthy pregnancy, the absolute first purple square is optimal brain development in utero and early childhood, but then you have to have healthy nutrition, the social and economic environments that are supportive to child rearing, the absence of poverty and exposure to violence and chaos. Responsive parenting, and then as you go through academic success and positive role models, you end up with this sense of self-efficacy and self-worth, sense of connectedness to social issues, healthy beliefs and clear standards. And then we've got this wonderful emotional resilience, the ability to participate in our society. So this Pathways to Resilience came directly out of Clyde's book. And of course, the flip side to that is the Pathways to Vulnerability, where in fact you've got the opposite side of all of that, where in fact your early neurological brain development is already compromised because of the very bad things that have happened, perhaps exposures in pregnancy, such as fetal alcohol syndrome and so on. There's poor self-regulation, and then the poor problem-solving skills, the naughty kid, the truancy, and alcohol, drugs, depression, and even leading to things like violent crime and suicides. These kinds of pathways are the novel thinking that Clyde and his team introduced. But for me, the causal pathway is something that's been incredibly important, not just for looking at the causes of this myriad of problems that are affecting children and young people, but because on those causal pathways, there are multiple opportunities for intervention to turn those pathways around. And that's why that causal pathway thinking is just so incredibly important for what we're doing in public health. And the last slide from Developmental Health and the Wealth of Nations was the first time that I had seen the results of the Preschool Project. And for those of you who can't see this, this is the age 27 outcomes of the randomised controlled trial of the Preschool Project, looking at not just the early childhood outcomes, but going right up to the fact that why these programs in early childhood were so important was that they led to more people working, more taxes being paid, less crime being done, and of course, this was the basis for a lot of the early interventions, saying for $1 invested, you get $7 return by the age 20 years later. So the three really important messages that I think we all got from this Bible of Early Child Development, edited by Clyde and written mostly by him, was that early child development influences health and well-being over the whole life course. Our genes and our environments interact during time, during development, to give us health and well-being or to give us the alternatives. That both latency and sequential pathway models were important, opening up all those incredible opportunities for intervention, and that early intervention works. Okay, the WHO Commission for the Social Determinants of Health, chaired by Michael Marmot. I actually confessed that I was a referee for Clyde to be on that commission and said that it couldn't be anybody better than that. Michael Marmot has told me that Chapter 5 of that commission was the most important chapter, that early child development is the great equaliser. This is where we can break the cycles of deprivation, that early years are critical for the whole life course, that individual child's chances for health, school success, economic participation, and social citizenry. I adored Clyde's words, by the way. I've plagiarised them my whole life. Nutritional deficiencies cause long-term damage, intellectual and physical health. Parents and community nurture are key, but are enabled or disabled by local, regional, national, and global circumstances. Think Syria, think war, think all of the things that are happening in our world at the moment. The place in which a child is born predicts her situation, whether she'll be in poverty, whether she'll be in child labour and other awful things that happen to kids, whether they'll be educated, whether they will have health, etc. And early child development is the best investment for nations. And so this was a very powerful document that came out in 2007. And this just shows the data of early childhood education, which sets up for disadvantaged children. This particular slide is from Clyde's. So you can see that in the early years, the difference between no early childhood interventions and having them is huge. That difference is enormous in the early years in terms of school readiness and in terms of even high school graduation. But look, college attendance and skilled professions. No early childhood education compared with early childhood education. Dramatic differences. It works. And this is also from the slide that Clyde gave at my festschrift. And this is the little piggy bank. And, the benefit, GDP growth of 1% for every 1% reduction in EDI vulnerability. So you can imagine that we've used that again and again when we're lobbying governments to improve that. And this is the last slide, which you don't actually have to, from that report, the Commission report, which again you don't have to look at the details, but it just shows the important thinking that Clyde had about these concentric circles of influence, and that while you could look at the child and its family and look at those risk factors, if you did that, you would ignore the big drivers that were really going to impact upon the level of competencies, health and well-being of that child and its family. So now I get to the last example I want to give of Clyde on the world stage, the Early Development Index. And this, again, is from Clyde's talk at my festschrift. The 5 domains of the EDI, of course, developed by Dan Offord and Magdalena Janus. Clyde's work in BC really demonstrated so well that this EDI could make such a difference to our society. And I just repeat what I said at the beginning. I believe that the GDP of child development, that the EDI can become our GDP of child development to counteract this juggernaut of a world encouraged to produce individual wealth to the detriment of the majority. And this is really, I think, the importance of these measures. It's the importance of why we're all here at this data linkage meeting. So I know you've seen a million slides of Clyde's like this. This shows, of course, the extraordinary variability in the percentage of children vulnerable on the EDI in Vancouver and British Columbia. So here is this amazing variability across just a very small geographic spread of children who are vulnerable on the EDI, which means that as they go through life, they will be either advantaged if they've done well or significantly disadvantaged if they have performed poorly on this EDI because of what went on before. But there are still opportunities to turn that around, as Clyde showed. So this shows how, in terms of the number of EDI vulnerabilities along the bottom, from 0 through to 5, how reading and numeracy is so strongly related to that EDI measures. So those three aspects, the developmental health, the wealth of nations, his work on the social determinants of health for the WHO, and the EDI, are the three bits of Clyde's on a world stage that I think have been so immensely powerful. And now I come to Clyde. This is where I think you will be amazed. It's almost like the EDI going viral, and it needs to. And you can see the uptake now of the EDI across all these countries, and you may not be aware of how that was happening. So, Clyde and Us, the Australian fan club. You can see that Clyde, this is actually a hilarious photo of Clyde, I think. There he was in full flight, Marcy, at my Festschrift. And I didn't know Marcy was going to mention about Clyde's comment, but this is the title slide of his talk at my retirement Festschrift, Fiona's Foreign Aid to Canada. So I've just turned that around and said, well, Clyde and Us, Clyde's Foreign Aid to Australia. And these are the things that I want to talk about. Firstly, the early child development in Australia would not have occurred without the combination of Clyde Hertzman and Fraser Mustard. It just would not have happened. You can't do things in your own country but bring in the experts from a place like Canada, who has led the world in early child development, and you can really make a difference. And we have made a huge difference because of Clyde Hertzman. Then, of course, it's the EDI. I think Clyde was probably a bit peeved that we had a national rollout of the AEDI before Canada had a national rollout of the EDI. But when you've got a good idea, we went with it. He helped me set up the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth, the longitudinal study of Australian children, and now we've got a longitudinal study of Indigenous children, all due to the fact that Clyde Hertzman put his name to these things. Record linkage, we'll talk about that. And I won't talk again about the fact that he spoke so brilliantly at my Festschrift. It was incredibly important to me, all the more important now because he's not here. And I ran the Festival of Ideas for the University of Melbourne last year, and he was going to be our top speaker on the Family and Children's Day. And so we dedicated that day to Clyde Hertzman, and it was much diminished because he wasn't there. So I just want to show you the next three slides, which we developed together, Clyde and I, to convince this very conservative politician, John Howard, who wasn't going to say sorry to Aboriginal people and who didn't really think that children were anything but widgets, and how we actually used the data to convince him to support the early childhood agenda in Australia. So the first slide, we did actually turn children into widgets. What we basically said was that if most children commence their lives in enabling full opportunities for healthy child development because of good environments, then we'd have most children mentally and physically healthy, reaching their educational and social potential, that we'd have young people participating to their full potential, that we'd have an intellectually competent and emotionally competent workforce, national economic prosperity, Mr. Howard. But the other things we said also, that we wouldn't have this huge drain on the health and welfare budget due to the increasing proportions of kids who were just falling out of the system. And that we would have a next generation of parents who were competent, socially, emotionally competent, and we would then have cycles of economic prosperity. So this is one of the most important slides that I presented to the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council. The next one was to all of the secretaries of every single government department in Canberra. It was the secretaries' retreat, and I had 10 minutes with a bit of coaching from Clyde to convince them that this was an important thing. Now, this slide's a very interesting one for Australians here, because this was Peter Costello, our treasurer, elected head of Treasury in Australia, and he put up what he called the generational slide. And what he was worried about was that because of falling fertility and an increasing welfare-dependent age, our competent workforce to compete in a global, knowledge-based world was going to be diminished. So what he said was, you have 2 children for yourself and have 1 for the nation. He wanted to increase our fertility to solve our problems of competent workforce. What he left out was what we put in, was this welfare-dependent young, where we showed all these data on what was going to happen. And this was the thing we reckoned you could turn around much more quickly and much more effectively by investing in early childhood. And we actually got people to put $1 on that for us. And so that was another very powerful slide. And then, having scared the shit out of them with giving them all the bad data about what was happening to kids, we then said there's the good news. And that child development and economic prosperity could come if we understood that there was such new knowledge about child development and health and well-being. And I mean, I know this stuff is so logical and it's innate that you should value children, and way back 150 years ago people did, but we have forgotten. Our kind of society has changed not to value children so much. That social and biological factors were important in early life. So this research on brains and neuroscience and biological embedding is really important research. Clear evidence of what works to enhance development and resilience has a positive impact across the whole of life. So this is the DOHAD agenda, it's the environmental child health agenda, and it is the Clyde Hertzman agenda, all coming together. That cycles of disadvantage can be broken by early interventions, and we gave as much evidence as we could about that. And this demanded urgent government, non-government and private sector participation. And it worked. We got federal and state governments on board. It was an absolutely exciting time. We got the EDI funded. We got early childhood across all states and territories as a priority. So some of the things that, of course, were driving us were the fact that we had data, linked data, on a whole lot of things which I call the wicked problems. So these are the things that we had in our data which we really felt were very important. And this is the stuff that's been driving me for all this time. I was shattered when I started looking at some of these data 20 years ago, that a country like Australia, as Clyde said, you know, these wealthy nations, were having things like rises in low birth weight, which predicts, again, your lifelong chances. Complex diseases like asthma, diabetes and obesity on the rise. Mental ill health is going to be, is already our problem of the 21st century. Substance abuse, things like fetal alcohol syndrome, teenage pregnancy, disabilities, the social dis-ease, child maltreatment. It's just an anguishing thing that that would be on the rise. We don't really know, but we believe that it is. The risk factors for it are. The behavioural problems, the disengaged youth, the educational problems, juvenile crime, workplace stress and reduction in human capital. I put these other ones up as well because I don't ever like to give a talk now without talking about climate change, because I think that's a huge issue for us. But these complex problems, these wicked problems have a complex causation, often multifactorial. Many start in early childhood. The treatment is ineffective and incredibly costly. They demand a preventive approach. And the problem with governments is their focus on the cure ends, which don't work. They wait until things are irreversible. Prevention is the real message that we needed to get across here, and they need a joined-up solution, these silo-driven activities. And that's what led to us setting up the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. We've linked now the longitudinal study of Australian children into the EDI, and the linked data is absolutely important. Perhaps I'm going to give you some redundant slides now, but I just want to go through a few of these wicked problems, which are the things that shattered me back 20 years ago when I was getting some of these data out. That we had rising rates of youth suicide, that we had increases in type 2 diabetes in children in WA. I think we now have 3-year-old Aboriginal children with type 2 diabetes in Australia. That child maltreatment and assault admissions are going up and up. Just as an aside, by the way, one of the best things to come out of the international data linkage meetings, the first one was a fabulous collaboration with Ruth Gilbert and in England and us, people in Canada, Manitoba, United States and New Zealand, and real international collaboration to look at this incredibly important problem of child maltreatment. And you can see here, that's another thing that causes us great anguish. And then the risk factors for these problems on the rise. This is from Melissa O'Donnell's Prior Mental Health of Mothers Giving Birth in Western Australia and the dramatic increase over time. These are all risk factors for poor outcomes. And whilst we don't have absolutely great data on substance abuse, what we do have is a proportion of neonates being born with heroin withdrawal. And this shows neonatal withdrawal syndrome in Western Australia from 1980 up to 2004. A scary kind of slide. So the next aspect after the early childhood agenda, which Clyde so incredibly influenced in Australia, was our Early Development Index. So here is the AEDI, the Australian Early Development Index. It's a collaboration between our institute and the child development people in Melbourne. And in fact, I brought back the EDI from Dan Offord in McMaster. We trialled it in the northern suburbs of Perth. We saw that it was going to work. And rapidly, Australia took up this challenge and now has an EDI. Very similar, of course, the domains that Clyde had in his slide. And now, across the whole of Australia, so this is the latest AEDI, 96.5% of all children in Australia now are having this 5-domain assessment at aged 5. And very similar kinds of outcomes to the ones that I've shown you earlier for Clyde. So we go from the most disadvantaged on the left there to the least advantaged. And you can see the all children is the first bar, and you can see the incredible relationship of being vulnerable on one or more of the AEDI domains and going down to the least disadvantaged. But the two other bars show people who've had a preschool or kindergarten program, so early childhood intervention, compared with children who don't. Look at that gap across the whole of the social stratum. So very similar kinds of outcomes to the ones that you have here in Canada. And this is just some local West Australian data, so we can do maps too, just like Clyde did of BC and Vancouver. And you can see this particular area I've highlighted here. The dark green is the children who are up to 60% vulnerable on one or more streams of the AEDI. And I would love Clyde to have seen this next slide, because what we did was to do what he did, and that is to give the data back to this community. And we did this in 2003. What happened? A universal early literacy project, a targeted Indigenous playgroup, a community park project focusing on physical and social development for children, an expanded playgroup provision in local schools with a school readiness focus, scholarships for primary age children, changed public transport routes. Wouldn't Clyde just love that? And what happened? Everything got better. Now, these are different groups of kids, of course, as you know. It's every 5-year-old. So every 2 years, you can see this improvement here. But this was done in a particular area. So it's 2003, 2004, 2008, and then when we did the national assessment in 2009. So here we have this amazing tool that not only measures on a population level what you do in early childhood, but you give the information to people and they change. And we have 2 outstanding areas now in Western Australia. One's the Chalice School and the other's the Roseworthy School, which are one-stop shops for early childhood. And everybody, all the GPs, the child health nurses, the early interventions, pregnancy programs are all located in these one-stop shops. And they have a high proportion of Aboriginal children. And the outcomes have been absolutely miraculous. They are national models. I get very emotional about this. They are national models for improving the outcome of the most vulnerable kids in our society. And there we are. Clyde, I would love you to have seen these data. And this, I'm sorry that you can't see this, but basically what it shows for each of the states in Australia on the left-hand side, in 1 to 3 months, 4 to 12 months, and 1 to 5 years, the kind of schedule of universal early childhood services. And there are some states that have got very rich early childhood services, like New South Wales and Victoria in particular. We're working on WA. It's interesting how you can't get things up in your own state, but never mind. But I'd like to point out that Queensland has no universal service. Victoria has a very rich one. And so are there some differences here? The highest percent of children developmentally vulnerable on the AEDI, and I know this is observational stuff, are those from Queensland. And the ones with the best or the lowest proportion of children vulnerable on the AEDI are Victoria. So I know it's observational and so on, but it just shows you how important we're showing these data now again to our government in Australia to show how important it is to continue the AEDI as a measure, but also to say how important this investment is. So now we come to the record linkage, this rather last, and I'm only touching on this briefly because, of course, we're going to be discussing this at length in this wonderful conference that's happening here in Canada. And this is the population level data that we now have over the life course in WA. And my team from Perth are here. Beck Glowett heads up this Developmental Pathways project. But this is basically the concept that we can start in pregnancy and go right through to adolescence and now beyond, using agency data, bringing it together to get a developmental pathway capacity for all the children born in Western Australia. Now, we have these data now from 1980 onwards, where we have our midwives' notifications of births, which sort of, if you like, start the cohort. It's a total population cohort. And what's been absolutely fantastic is the linkage, the partnerships that we've developed with all of the government departments who have anything to do with the care, welfare of children. And so you can't read all these, I'm sorry, but it's our institute is collaborating with the university and, of course, the WA Department of Health, and Di Rosman is here, who heads up our data linkage unit, without whom nothing would happen. I think that Di is an absolutely outstanding person for all of this. But we've got departments of health, child protection, communities, housing, health, the Mental Health Commission, education, corrective services, disability services, the Attorney General, the police, the Treasury and Finance, Indigenous Affairs, Curriculum Council, and housing. So we can actually chart kids through and use these data. And the reason it's so powerful is because, again, we can not only look at these pathways, but the agency custodians, the bureaucrats who are in charge of these data, are beginning to realise the power of it. And of course, the translation of our research into action is right there, because they are at the table. And we even have bureaucrats co-supervising PhD students in their work for this. Clyde was a consultant to this project and a referee for almost every single grant application that we gave, letters of support and so on. We would not have got this data up, I believe, this fantastic project, if it hadn't been for Clyde Hertzman. So I want to now get to building on Clyde's legacy. And I want to start by talking about the challenges of our culture, which I guess I've touched upon a bit. Our society and where it's heading and how it values children and how it values, or doesn't, the most vulnerable. I want to touch on political leadership, the role of big business. I want to talk a bit about marginalised populations, so dear to our hearts, and think about how we need to write a new story for our children. So this is my Clyde Hertzman diagram. Child in the middle with its family, its community, its school. So important to look at that and how it is enabled or disabled by that outer circle of social, workplace, political, economic, spiritual activities. On your right here, I have listed the kinds of cultural beliefs and values that I think are damaging to children. And on the left-hand side are the ones that I think are nurturing and positive for children. And I call this a civil society on the left and an uncivil one on the right. So my point that I'm making is that I believe that we're more uncivil than civil, that we have more inequalities and rising inequalities. We have fear and violence rather than trust and care. We have an incredible priority for material wealth rather than a collective good, that parents aren't valued, that we fast-track childhoods, that we focus on cures more than prevention, that we have environmental degradation rather than protecting environments. We have safe places for the few. We have excessive use of damaging technologies and adults' needs more than children's. And I just want to illustrate this. Marcy mentioned I was Australian of the Year in 2003, and I used it as a soapbox. And one of the most important talks I gave was to the National Press Club, which is televised nationally. And the talk I gave was entitled, plagiarising again from Canada, The Real Brain Drain and the Importance of Early Child Development and Inequalities in Australia. And I had a stunningly silent response to this talk. I had put my entire manifesto for the world into this talk. And there was a deafening silence from these bureaucrats and journalists. But a week later, 2 pages of cartoons appeared from one of our top cartoonists in Australia. And I realised that You can't read this, so I'm going to have to read it again for you. And this is from Michael Leunig, who is what I call a spiritual cartoonist. And the first one says, why are so many children in crisis and cracking up? The answer, because we've got such a great democracy. Why are the children cracking up? Because we're the lucky country. Okay then, why are so many adults cracking up? Because things are great and we're the great good guys. Why are the children cracking up? Why? Because we are free. Why are so many Australian children cracking up? Not this again, you're being negative. I was told this. Haven't you got anything good to say about Australia, I was told. Yes, but why are the children cracking up? Negative is a dark, un-Australian evil. This is a land of sunshine and opportunity, and you're a boring loser. Yeah, but why are so many children cracking up? Australia is a relaxed, sporting nation of positive, friendly winners, so just chill out. Okay, all right, but why are the children cracking up? We have a world-class, award-winning, democratic society with a booming economy and golden beaches. I rang Michael Leunig and said, can I use this as a frontispiece for the book, which we wrote called Children of the Lucky Country, ? Why Australia is not valuing its children, and he gave them to me, so I treasure them. But in a way, it puts into a funny perspective what I'm talking about in terms of our society. We just cannot forget how important investing in early childhood and valuing our children and our parents are for Australian society. And I'm a New Yorker freak, and of course there's a New Yorker cartoon for everything. And there's the president with his 3 advisors, and he says, have you figured out a way that I can be on the right side of history without being on the wrong side of now? And that's really what it's about. And I'd just sort of like to remind you that after the global financial crisis, which I thought everyone would see how despicable it was that we had wealth creation as our goal and GDP as our measure, and there's not one Wall Street person who's actually even got to court yet, let alone jailed. So we have a challenge here of our society that doesn't seem to value the kinds of things that I think everybody in this conference, what I love about the International Data Linkage people, what I love about the early childhood conferences we go to, is that we're all really great, highly moral, socially just people, and I love it. But basically, if we want to make a difference, if we want to build on Clyde's legacy, then we've got to change the people that we talk to, and we've got to stop talking to each other. And this is a quote from recommendation 4 of Clyde's 2007 Social Determinants of Health. And he says, okay, the global consensus on early child development, we've got to get it, but we've got to widen the audience to those not traditionally thought of as stakeholders. And he mentions the financial and planning departments, the economic sector, the corporate world, and the media. So my message from this talk today is that we do need to sell that message more broadly. We've got to engage those powerful corporate business leaders who are so strongly influencing and lobbying government. In Australia at the moment, there's been a debacle because of the corruption of these lobbyists in Australia, and political heads are falling all over the place. But why should they even have started? Do they think we're stupid that they are so corrupt in terms of what's happening? And the decisions that are being made in our society, the national agendas, are not ones that are going to be nurturing children unless we get out there and sell this big time. So one of the things I'm going to suggest is, like we used to have environmental impact assessments, that we have a child impact assessment. Now, we put this up in 2002 to the Conservative government and they didn't run with it. But now we could run with it. We could run with it again, that for every piece of legislation, for every social policy that's been put up, let's look at how it might impact upon our children and their development. And in fact, we can measure it, because of course, we've got the EDI. So I think we have a call to arms here in Clyde's legacy to make a difference to our societies so that our children will grow up with different trajectories than the ones that are happening at the moment. So I now want to touch upon the marginalised populations. And this is the causal pathway that I use all the time to demonstrate why our Aboriginal people, our First Nations people, are in the situations that they are in today with the huge inequalities that I will show you. So if we're talking about the rising inequalities in Australia, this is one that is totally unacceptable but it is understandable because of what we have done to Aboriginal people. From colonisation, we have marginalised, we have taken children away, we have taken land away, we have taken culture away, and when you do that to a population, then the poverty, the poor education, the unemployment, the alcohol and substance abuse, the poor living conditions, poor nutrition, results in all of the problems we see today. So these things are absolutely ones that require interventions early rather than waiting. As I said to one of our senior government health people the other day, it's okay and probably humane to put renal dialysis units in remote rural areas, but it will only increase the numbers of people with renal disease. It will not decrease them. What are the pathways into renal problems? And that's what we should be doing to prevent this from happening. So here we have two populations in Australia. On the right-hand side, you can see our non-Aboriginal ageing population, and on the left-hand side, you can see our population that's growing young, our Aboriginal population. And this slide, given to me by Tom Karma, our Aboriginal Social Justice Commissioner, shows you this incredible mortality gap, the life expectancy differences between Aboriginal people on the left in red and non-Aboriginal people on the right. So here's the extreme example, if you like, of inequality in Australian society. And there are just 2 points I want to make from this next slide, and that is 50% of Aboriginal population is aged under 20. 50%. So what does that mean in terms of their ability to participate in our society, to actually do things that are going to make a difference to themselves? And the other point I want you to look at is that for every Australian child, there are nearly 3 adults, the adult-to-child ratio. For Aboriginal kids, it's just 1.19. And many of those Aboriginal parents are in jail, have mental health problems, or have substance abuse. So this is a really challenging for us. But we can actually make a big difference here, and we are starting to. There are now nearly 300 early childhood programs that are run by Aboriginal organisations in Australia, and this federal government is about to cut them. So one of the things I had to do before I came away was to write several letters to the Prime Minister and the heads of various departments to plead with them that early childhood was the way we could break this cycle of disadvantage and marginalisation. So this is what we're trying to get across, that we need an investment in a comprehensive early years system for Aboriginal people, that we have to have parent empowerment and engagement. This is a hugely important issue for Aboriginal kids. That we need to have proportionate universalism. I'll show you a slide about that in a minute. But the real issue here is that we need Aboriginal-led and controlled solutions. The imposition from Canberra and from other governments of one-size-fits-all policies in Aboriginal populations has failed with a huge investment of totally wasted money. What do I mean by proportionate universalism? I mean the universal application of early childhood services, but with people who are marginalised and at very high risk, you then target with high intensity these particular populations. So I think really it's absolutely vital to us to emphasise that breaking the intergenerational cycles of deprivation and damage that we have done are really, really important to get across to government. And we just must not give up. There's a huge load of trauma, there's stress, there's alcohol, there's damaged kids. We must not give up on these generations of Aboriginal children. Okay, now having solved early childhood for everybody and reducing inequalities and all the rest of it, should we now change the world? I think Clyde would like us to do that. And the last slide really that I have, I want to talk to you about the OECD Global Project. And this is something that we've been involved in now for about 8 to 10 years. In fact, Michael Wolfson, who's here, has been at the meetings that I've been at as well. And this is a project of the wealthy countries, except now increasingly the developing world is actually joining this project. And it's going gangbusters. And it's about using measures other than GDP to measure and foster the progress of societies. It was really initiated by Enrico Giovannini, who was the chief statistician at OECD, went back to Italy to be their statistician, is now going to come back to OECD. It's supported by Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, Nicholas Stern. The Sarkozy Commission in Paris has been very important in this. But they're all making the point that the GDP is such a flawed measure. I mean, if you sell more cigarettes, your GDP goes up. If you have a war and sell more arms, your GDP goes up. It's very flawed. But apart from that, it's too singularly focusing on wealth creation. So I have just got up here some points about the global project, that official statistics are a public good that foster societal progress. Statistical indicators needed for social, environmental, as well as for economic outcomes, so bring on the alternatives to GDP. It enables citizen engagement and democracy because the data gets to citizens and they can make decisions. It builds accountability of public policies, and good comparable data enables international comparisons and national aspirations, and that's something that I am absolutely committed to. And I was privileged to chair the child wellbeing session at the last OECD meeting in New Delhi in October last year, and absolutely sold the EDI to this community to say, even if we had no other measure, I reckon that if we had EDI around the world, those countries that had good EDIs and a very low proportion of kids vulnerable on the EDI would be the best countries in the world. So I just want to thank some people before I have my final slide. So don't break into uproarious applause until I have got the last slide up, please. I want to acknowledge Marcy Cohen, and I think the conversations that we've had together have inspired me to do the best I can for Clyde Hertzman today, and I'm just thrilled to meet with you, and I hope that this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. And Pippa from HELP, and Nancy, of course, from UBC, all the people in Australia who've helped me with the various aspects of this presentation, and Michael Marmot from the UK. And I just want to end by saying that I wanted to give you all a sense of the man who made the best science, used the best science to care for children, and they and his memory deserve this. Hence my title. And does science have a soul? Yes, and its name was Clyde Hertzman. Thank you very much.